can fix it.
You can fix my $9 million tarmac?
I can fix this. The CEO stopped shouting. The engineers froze. Every man on that tarmac turned, slowly, together, toward the voice. It belonged to a boy. 12 years old. Barefoot. Clothes so worn they had faded to a color Lagos has no name for. No badge. No tools. No reason to be standing on a private airstrip in front of a grounded executive helicopter that a billionaire and 3 certified engineers had been fighting for 40 minutes. Chief Obiora Emmanuel Nwosu, one of the most powerful men in West Africa, a man with a $400 million meeting dissolving by the minute in Port Harcourt, looked at this child. Looked at the empty hands. Looked at the eyes that did not flinch. And he laughed. The engineers laughed so hard. The kind of laughter that fills a silence and says, "We needed that." The boy did not move. Did not look at the ground. Did not blink. He waited. "I can fix it," he said again. "And if I am wrong, you lose nothing. But if I am right, you are in Port Harcourt by 9. The laughter stopped. Chief Nwosu stared at this child for a long time. 5 minutes, he said. 9 minutes and 47 seconds later, that engine roared to life. The silence that followed was the loudest thing anyone on that tarmac had ever heard. But to understand what happened in those 9 minutes, to truly understand what it means that a hungry 12-year-old child did what trained engineers could not, you have to go back. Because this story did not begin on that airstrip. It did not begin with a CEO and his $400 million. It began with a father. A report that nobody read. And a debt that power had spent years convincing itself it would never have to pay. Before we go deeper, drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not subscribed yet, do that now, so you never miss a story like this one. His name was Chukwuemeka Dike. If you had seen him walking to work in the early morning, toolbox in one hand, thermos of black tea in the other, head held at that particular angle that said, "I know exactly what I am doing, and I dare anyone to suggest otherwise," you would have understood immediately that this was a man built for precision. A man who had found, somewhere in his early 20s, the exact intersection between passion and skill, and had planted himself there like a flag in the earth and refused to move. Chukwuemeka was an aviation maintenance technician. But to call him simply a technician is to call the ocean simply wet. He did not just understand aircraft. He felt them. He had a relationship with engines and hydraulic systems and fuel flow regulators the way certain musicians have a relationship with their instruments. Not mechanical, not transactional, but intimate. He could listen to an engine the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat, and in the hesitations, in the subtle wrong notes that nobody else could hear, he could tell you exactly what was broken before he had even lifted a wrench. His colleagues respected him. Some feared him a little, the way people fear those who are simply and undeniably better than everyone else in the room. His supervisors relied on him the way institutions always rely on their best people. Quietly, completely, and without ever fully acknowledging it. He had a wife named Ngozi. A small apartment in Enugu with a ceiling fan that wobbled slightly on the left side and a kitchen that smelled of onions and palm oil and something warm that had no name but felt exactly like home. He had a son. He had Somto. Somto was born in the rainy season, which in Enugu means he arrived already surrounded by the sound of water finding its way through every crack and crevice in the city. Because water has never, in the history of the world, accepted that something is truly closed to it. From the very beginning, Somto was a child who watched. Not in the absent, glassy-eyed way some children watch, but with a focused, hungry quality that his mother called unsettling and his father called exactly like me. He watched his father most of all. The way a student watches a master, with reverence, with hunger, with the unspoken understanding that what was being demonstrated in front of him was something rare. On weekends, Chukwuemeka would spread his tools across the concrete floor of their building's compound and work on neighbors' generators, motorcycles, broken appliances that people brought to him the way, in old stories, people brought their problems to wise men. Somto would sit, always within arm's reach, always perfectly still, and watch his father's hands. Those large, careful, extraordinarily competent hands. Hands that never trembled. Hands that always knew exactly where they were going. When Somto was 4 years old, he took apart a broken radio his father had set aside. Used only a small screwdriver and the memory of watching. Put it back together. Not perfectly. 2 screws remained, which troubled him deeply. But correctly enough that it worked. When his father found him, Chukwuemeka said nothing for a long moment. Simply looked at his son. Then picked him up, small and serious and still frowning at those 2 screws, and held him with a ferocity that surprised them both. "You are going to be something," his father said. "Something this world has never seen before." Somto did not fully understand those words. But he felt their weight land somewhere deep and permanent inside him, not understood with the mind, but known with something older. By the time Somto was 6, his father had begun teaching him deliberately. Not the kind of teaching that happens in classrooms, with textbooks and the anxiety of being judged. The kind that happens between a father and a son in the quiet hours of an evening, the city settled into itself, a single bulb above them, tools laid out on an old cloth on the floor like the pieces of a language they were learning together. Chukwuemeka taught him the names of things first. He believed, and he was right, that if you know the true name of something, not just the word but the identity, the function, the reason for existence, you have already begun to understand it. A fuel flow regulator. A hydraulic actuator. A control surface. A pressure relief valve. He taught his son these names the way other fathers teach their sons the names of rivers, of ancestors, of constellations. As inheritance. As a way of saying, this world has a structure and I am giving you the key. He taught him to listen before he touched. He taught him that most people who cannot fix things cannot fix them not because they lack knowledge, but because they lack the patience to hear what is wrong. The noise a machine makes when it is broken, Chukwuemeka said one evening, eyes on the disassembled generator between them, is not different from the noise a person makes when they are in pain. It is communication. It is a request. Something saying, please. I need help. Do not walk past it. Stop. And listen. And then the world, which had been so good to them, showed its other face. Chukwuemeka filed an internal report with Zenith Aviation Services about a systemic fault he had identified in 3 of the company's helicopters. The fault was in the fuel flow regulation system. Not immediately dangerous in all conditions. But under specific operational pressures, high altitude, extended flight, it created the conditions for catastrophic engine failure. He documented it precisely. Outlined the exact fault. Proposed the exact solution. Calculated the cost of the repair and set it against the cost of not repairing it, in plain language any executive could understand. He submitted it to his supervisor. Followed up twice. Was told both times the matter was being reviewed. The matter was not being reviewed. The company was under financial pressure. Its leadership made the calculation that powerful institutions sometimes make when money is tight and the problem is not yet visible. The risk is theoretical. The cost is real. We will wait. They decided to wait. Chukwuemeka could not. He was not looking at numbers on a page. He was looking at machines he had touched with his own hands, and he knew, with the certainty that only genuine mastery produces, that it was not a question of if, only when. He escalated, went above his supervisor, sent his report to the safety division, requested a meeting with the operations director. The meeting was denied. He was told, by people using careful language to say something neither careful nor honest, that his concerns had been noted, that the matter was in good hands. It was not in good hands. 6 months later, one of the helicopters he had flagged went down over the Niger Delta. The pilot survived. The 2 engineers on board did not. And Chukwuemeka Dike, who had seen it coming, who had done everything a man of conscience could do to stop it, was not praised. Not vindicated. Not asked to lead the investigation. He was blamed. Not openly. The company was too careful for that. But in the quiet, suffocating way that institutions punish those who inconvenience them, sudden reassignments to lesser work, performance reviews that now described him as difficult, supervisors who had once been accessible and were no longer. The message arrived with perfect clarity. You caused a problem by seeing the problem. And we will not forgive you for it. He fought. Contacted the aviation authority. Found a lawyer. Pushed with everything he had, because he was the kind of man for whom silence, comfortable, self-protecting silence, was simply not available. The company let him go. They called it restructuring. Ngozi held the family together with a ferocity some women discover in themselves when the alternative is collapse. She sold food from a small stall, borrowed money and repaid it carefully, kept Somto in school, kept the ceiling fan running. But Chukwuemeka had changed. A man who places his identity inside his work, and then watches that work turned into a weapon against him, does not recover easily. The fight drained him. The injustice consumed him, not explosively, but slowly. The way a termite consumes a beam. Day by day. From the inside. Until what looks solid from the outside is hollow. He still taught Somto on evenings when the exhaustion allowed it. But there was something different in his voice. A grief with no ceremony. A loss with no name. Somto was 8 years old. He sat beside his father in the evenings and watched those hands, still the most competent hands he had ever seen, and felt the growing distance between what those hands were and what they were now being allowed to do. The word came to him years later, on the streets of Lagos, when he finally had language for everything his childhood had made him feel. Wrong. Simply, unbearably, completely wrong. And then one evening, when Somto was 9, Chukwuemeka Dike did not come home. He had taken a contract to service equipment at a small private airfield outside Enugu. He left in the morning. Called Ngozi at noon to say he would be home for dinner. He did not come home for dinner. He did not come home at all. They found his toolbox at the airfield. They found his thermos, still holding the last cold inch of black tea he had not finished. As though he had set it down for just a moment. As though he fully intended to come back for it. They did not find him. The police concluded, an accident. A drainage channel. Heavy rain that week. Fast current. Body not recovered. Ngozi did not believe them. She said so, loudly, persistently, to anyone who would listen. But she was a woman without money and without connections, fighting an explanation assembled by people who knew that the most effective lies are built around a small, verifiable truth. It had been raining. The channels had been fast. An accident was plausible. She fought for 2 years. Then the grief, which had been waiting with extraordinary patience, arrived in full. Ngozi died of what the doctors listed as cardiac complications. Anyone who had watched her during those 2 years would have called it something simpler. A broken heart that had run out of the will to keep beating. Somto was 11 years old. He had no family willing to take him. He had a small collection of his father's tools, the ones nobody had thought to claim, and he had everything his father had taught him, stored inside him with a permanence that not even the worst years could touch. And he had the streets. Survival implies passivity. Implies holding on, waiting for rescue. Somto did not wait for rescue. He observed. He learned. He stored. He found a mechanic's workshop in Oshodi, loud, chaotic, the air always thick with oil and rubber and burning metal. The mechanics there quickly discovered that the small, quiet boy who appeared near their gate one morning and did not leave was not a nuisance. He was an asset. He was 11 years old, and he could hand the right tool before it was asked for. He could listen to an engine for 30 seconds and say, in a voice so quiet you had to lean in, "The timing is off. Something wrong with the fuel injection on the second cylinder." And he was right. Almost always right. The mechanics, hard men, men who had no patience for children underfoot, looked at each other the first time it happened. Then they looked at him. Then they made space for him. But respect did not always mean food. And a child on the streets of Lagos needs to eat every day. So Somto built a second trade, quieter, entirely his own. He scavenged the edges of motor parks, industrial compounds, anywhere that broken things accumulated and no one had thought to claim them. a generator missing a part, a radio with a blown circuit, a fan motor seized from lack of oil. Things that looked dead. Things that Legos had decided were finished. Somto would pick them up, study them, fix them, and sell them. It kept him alive. And more than that, it sharpened him. Every broken thing he fixed was a lesson his father had taught him, made real. Every machine that came back to life in his hands was proof that the knowledge his father had placed inside him was not theoretical. It worked. It was real. It was his. He grew. From a small, silent 11-year-old into a lean, focused 12-year-old whose hands had begun to develop the same quality his father's possessed. The quality of knowing, without hesitation, exactly where they were going and why. He read everything he could find. Technical manuals that customers left behind. Old aviation maintenance guides from a second-hand bookshop in Ikeja, carried back wrapped in plastic against the rain, read by the light of a work lamp until the words dissolved into his memory and became part of the architecture of who he was. He was 12 years old, and he understood aircraft fuel systems better than most adults who worked on them for a living. He carried his father's grief and his mother's grief and the grief of 2 men who had died over the Niger Delta because a report was stamped and filed and forgotten. He carried all of this the way his father had taught him to carry a machine's distress signal, with patience, with steadiness, with the refusal to walk past it. Beneath the grief, beneath the hunger, beneath the years the streets had already carved into him, there was a signal. Steady. Quiet. Unbreakable. There is something still wrong. And it has not been fixed. And someone needs to fix it. He felt the pull of it every morning he woke up on the workshop floor. He just did not know yet that the machine was much larger than any he had worked on before. The name of the man who would become the axis around which everything in this story turns is Chief Obiora Emmanuel Nwosu. He was not a man who existed quietly. His name appeared on buildings, in business columns, in the kinds of conversations that powerful men have in rooms most people will never enter. He had built Nwosu Aviation Logistics from a single helicopter charter operation into one of the largest private aviation and logistics companies in West Africa, through genuine business intelligence, through ruthlessness, through an absolute refusal to accept that anything was impossible. 61 years old. Built like a man who had once been physically powerful and remained physically imposing, the kind of presence that comes not from size but from certainty. A face that defaulted to severity. Eyes that had seen everything and filed it all away. When they looked at you, you felt, involuntarily, immediately, assessed. He had earned every naira. He was at the office before anyone else and left after everyone else had gone. He made decisions faster than anyone around him and was right more often than seemed reasonable. He had built something real, something that employed thousands and moved goods and people across a continent. But there is always a but. With great men, there is always a but. Chief Nwosu had grown powerful in an environment that rewarded speed over deliberation, action over consideration. He had internalized this so completely that he had lost the ability to distinguish between the situations where it served him and the situations where it would one day cost him everything. He had also stopped truly listening to the people below him. Not from malice, but from the arrogance that unchecked success produces in men already inclined toward confidence. The arrogance that says, "I have been right so many times that my judgment no longer requires the input of others." He did not remember a report filed by a maintenance technician named Chukwuemeka Dike. He had not read it himself. He had delegated. Moved on. He did not remember. And that fact, not yet a moral indictment, not yet, was lying very quietly in wait. Chief Nwosu arrived at his private airstrip before the city had fully woken up. A meeting in Port Harcourt at 9. 3 months in the making. A Singaporean logistics consortium. A contract worth in excess of $400 million. The kind of meeting that happens once in a decade. The kind that does not reschedule. His helicopter was supposed to be ready. It was not ready. His chief pilot, Captain Adewale Bello, 7 years flying for Chief Nwosu, a man who understood his employer's relationship with punctuality the way sailors understand the tide, was standing next to the aircraft wearing an expression constructed specifically to deliver bad news without triggering the full force of what Chief Nwosu's anger looked like when it was fully unleashed. "Sir," Captain Bello said at the moment Chief Nwosu stepped out of the car and began moving toward the aircraft with the momentum of a man who does not expect to stop until he is airborne. "Sir, we have a situation." Chief Nwosu stopped. He looked at the helicopter, at Captain Bello, at the three engineers near the engine housing, expressions ranging from stressed to terrified. What situation? Not a question. A statement. In the register, those who worked for him recognized as the one that preceded consequences. Captain Bello explained. An anomaly detected during pre-flight checks. A hesitation in the engine start sequence. Diagnostics inconclusive. Manual check suggested a possible fault in the fuel flow regulation system, but the engineers were not in agreement on the nature of the problem or its solution. "You are not in agreement," Chief Nwosu said. The engineers were not in agreement. He looked at his watch. At the sky, already bright, already golden, Lagos always awake before the rest of the world had decided to open its eyes. Then back at the aircraft. Port Harcourt. $400 million. A window that would not open again. And then Chief Obiora Emmanuel Nwosu, a man who had built an empire by keeping his fury precisely channeled, precisely deployed, let it go. He turned on his engineers and he shouted. Not the controlled, cold displeasure he usually allowed himself. He shouted. His voice crossed the tarmac, went past the fences, and poured into the morning air of the industrial outskirts of Lagos, where it reached people who had no idea what was happening and no reason to care. It reached a 12-year-old boy who was picking through a pile of discarded equipment at the edge of a nearby compound, looking for something broken enough to be abandoned and fixable enough to sell. Somto had come to that part of Lagos that morning for one reason. He was hungry. He had not eaten since the previous afternoon, half a plate of rice that one of the Oshodi mechanics had shared with him before closing the workshop for the night. That morning he had woken before sunrise, gathered his small cloth bag, and set out for the industrial compounds on the outskirts of the area, where broken equipment collected at the edges of properties the way dead leaves collect at the base of walls. Generators, fan motors, pump casings, circuit boards, things that people had stopped believing in, things that Somto could make believe again. He had been working the perimeter of a fenced compound near the airstrip, nothing useful yet, mostly rust and cracked plastic, when he heard it. Shouting. Not the ordinary shouting of a Lagos morning. Not the market arguments or the bus park friction of a city of 20 million people living too close together. This was different. This was the shouting of a man accustomed to absolute control, confronting the specific anguish of a situation that was not responding to his will. It came over the fence and landed in Somto's ears with an urgency that made him stop moving. He stood still. He listened. Somewhere beyond that fence, a machine was failing. Somto could not see it yet. But he could hear, carried on the same morning air that carried the shouting, the faint, irregular sound of an engine in distress. The specific hesitation. The wrong note. He knew that sound. He had known it since he was 6 years old, and his father had crouched beside him on a compound floor and explained that machines in pain speak, if you have the patience to listen. He set down his cloth bag. He walked toward the fence, found the gap, the kind that always exists in fences around Lagos industrial compounds, because Lagos always finds a way through, and stepped onto the edge of the tarmac. What he saw, a private airstrip. A large executive helicopter with its engine cowling open. 3 engineers in white uniforms clustered around it, each one holding something, none of them fixing anything. And further away, pacing, a heavy-set man in a dark suit, whose entire body radiated the fury of someone for whom the universe had failed to cooperate. The man was still shouting. At the engineers. At the helicopter. At the morning sky. He did not yet know that a hungry 12-year-old boy had just stepped through a gap in his perimeter fence. Somto listened to the engine. He closed his eyes. He tilted his head. His father's voice came to him, quiet, clear, certain. Stop. And listen. He listened. And then he knew. It was not the hydraulic system. Not the control surfaces. It was the fuel flow regulator. A blockage, or a calibration fault, causing inconsistent fuel delivery. Under normal conditions, manageable, producing exactly the kind of ambiguous reading that confused engineers looking for something dramatic. But under extended high-load flight, over water, at altitude, it would produce an engine failure that nobody on board would walk away from. He stood on the edge of that tarmac. 12 years old. Hungry. Wearing clothes that Lagos had already worn half to nothing. He knew what he knew. He also knew exactly how stepping forward would be received. He was on the wrong side of every line the city had ever drawn between the people it protected and the people it did not. He weighed it. And then he walked forward. He walked directly toward the group, not running, not hesitating, the particular walk of someone who has already made a decision and is simply closing the distance. An engineer saw him first. Hey, get away from here. This is a restricted area. Somto did not stop. He looked at the engineer with an expression that was not confrontational, not apologetic. Simply present. The expression of a child who has long since stopped allowing adult reactions to determine what he does with what he knows. There is something wrong with the fuel flow regulator, he said. Not the hydraulics. The fuel flow regulator. There is a blockage or a calibration fault causing inconsistent delivery. The diagnostic is reading it as a hydraulic issue because the pressure drop mimics one. But the problem is upstream. Silence. Every head turned. Chief Obiora Emmanuel Nwosu, mid-sentence, mid-fury, stopped. He turned. He looked at what had spoken. A boy. 12, maybe 13. Thin. In clothes that had been through too much. Standing on his tarmac without a badge or a uniform or any visible reason to be there. A face that hardship had already begun to carve. Not broken, not defeated, but stripped of everything unnecessary. Eyes looking directly at him with a calmness he could not categorize. A child. Looking at him. Calmly. Having walked onto his private airstrip from nowhere to tell his engineers what was wrong with his helicopter. Who are you? Chief Nwosu asked. I can fix this, Somto said. A single suspended moment. The kind the universe produces when it places something in front of you that your entire framework has no category for. And then Chief Nwosu laughed. He laughed the way a man laughs when an absurdity is simply too complete for any other response. This child. This ragged, hungry, trespassing child, telling him he can fix what 3 trained engineers cannot. The engineers laughed. Not because they found it funny. But when the most powerful person on the tarmac laughs, everyone within earshot manages their response accordingly. Somto waited. Let the laughter run its course. Did not look at the ground. Did not shift his weight. He stood there, still and 12 years old, and waited, the way his father had taught him to wait when he knew something the people around him did not. The laughter was not about him. It was about the size of the gap between what these people believed and what was true. All he had to do was wait for that gap to close. I can fix it, he said again. And if I am wrong, you lose nothing. You are already grounded. But if I am right, you are in Port Harcourt by 9. Chief Nwosu stared at this child for a long time. 5 minutes, he said. Captain Bello timed it. He needed something external to confirm what his own eyes were telling him, that a boy of 12 or 13 was doing what 3 trained engineers had spent 40 minutes failing to do. The engineers would later describe it technically. Correctly identified fault. Unconventional but mechanically sound repair. Effective result. They said all of this in the careful language of people trying to reintegrate something into the structure of what they understood. They did not say, a child did this. They did not know how to say that and still sound like the professionals they needed to believe they were. Captain Bello described it differently. He said, and he would say it for years, that watching Somto work on that helicopter was like watching someone have a conversation. That there was a quality to it beyond technique. That the boy moved the way water moves, finding the path every time, no hesitation, no wasted motion, as though the machine itself was guiding his hands. And he would always add, quietly, that the boy's hands were still a child's hands. Small. Not yet fully formed. And they moved with a certainty that he himself, with 40 years of aviation, could not match. Chief Nwosu said almost nothing about it to anyone for a very long time. He watched this child, this hungry child who had come through a fence to follow the sound of shouting, and something happened inside him that had no name. The particular discomfort of a man beginning, without having chosen to revise something so fundamental that the revision requires reconstructing everything built on top of it. He had laughed at a child. He had laughed at the child of the man whose warning he had ignored. And then the engine started. There are sounds in this world that carry more meaning than they appear to. The sound of a door opening when you have been waiting in the dark. Rain after a long dry season. A name called by a voice you had stopped expecting to hear. The sound of that engine igniting, clear, clean, entirely correct, was one of those sounds. It moved through the airstrip not as noise but as a verdict. The engineers went silent. Captain Bello exhaled a breath he had been holding for 9 minutes and 47 seconds. Chief Nwosu did not move. Somto stepped back from the aircraft, wiped his small hands on a cloth one of the engineers held out to him, almost involuntarily, the gesture of a man whose body had processed what his mind had not yet caught up to. He turned to face Chief Nwosu. "It will hold," he said. "But get the calibration reviewed properly within 40 hours. Do not push it beyond that." 12 years old. On a Lagos airstrip in the early morning. Giving technical instructions to a man who could buy and sell everything Somto had ever owned 1,000 times over. Chief Nwosu looked at him. The severity still in his face, but something moving beneath it now, surfacing, unstoppable, refusing to be sent back down. "What is your name?" he asked. "Somto." "Somto what?" A pause. The length of a held breath. "Somto Dike." The air changed. Nothing anyone watching could have pointed to or described. But it changed, the way a room changes when a window is opened that has been sealed for years. The name moved through Chief Nwosu like a key finding a lock he had not known existed. "I want to give you money," Chief Nwosu said. "Name your amount." Somto looked at him. Direct. Unperformed. The look of a child who has been through enough to look at a billionaire the way most people cannot manage to look at anyone. "No." Chief Nwosu blinked. The word landed differently coming from a child. Not less powerfully. Differently. "No. No." "Why not?" Somto looked at the helicopter. He looked at it the way his father had taught him to look at machines. Fully, seeing everything. Then he looked back at the man in front of him. "My father worked for your company," he said. The words were quiet. Not an accusation. Not dressed in the anger that would have been entirely justified. Simply placed into the air the way a child sets down something very heavy that he has been carrying for a very long time, and has finally found the right place to set it. He warned you about faulty systems. He filed reports. He documented everything. He tried to prevent what happened to those men over the Niger Delta. Nobody listened. Then he disappeared. My mother died fighting to understand why. And I have been on these streets since I was 11 years old. A silence so complete it had physical weight. Chief Nwosu looked at this child. This 12-year-old who had just fixed his helicopter and was now looking at him with the eyes of someone who had been carrying the cost of a decision this company made years ago, carrying it in his body, on his skin, in the calluses on his small hands. "I did not fix your helicopter for money," Somto said. "I fixed it because it was broken. Because a broken machine that nobody fixes eventually hurts someone. That is what my father taught me. That is the only thing he ever truly taught me." He looked at the helicopter one last time. Then at the man in front of him. "I think your flight is ready, sir." Chief Nwosu made it to Port Harcourt. He made the meeting. Said everything that needed to be said, with a fluency and authority that had built an empire over 2 decades. But he was only partially present. He had never in his life sat in a meeting and been only partially there. He was a man of total focus. It was one of the foundations of everything he had built. Yet he sat in that room, and a significant part of his mind refused to leave that airstrip. Refused to leave a 12-year-old child who had come through a gap in a fence with a cloth bag for collecting broken things, and fixed what no one else could fix. Refused to leave those two words. Somto Dike. He had known a Dike. His company had known a Chukwuemeka Dike. The details did not come immediately. The mind protects itself from the details of things it would prefer not to remember. But he felt the knowledge there, beneath the protection. Felt its weight. The quality of something that has always been true and has simply, until now, been stored in a room with the door closed. A child. 11 years old when he hit the streets. 12 years old when he stepped onto that tarmac. And in those 2 years, between the death of a father and the death of a mother and the workshop floor of Oshodi, the boy had held on to everything his father had placed inside him. Had held it and fed it and built it into something that no university had taught, no company had certified, no institution had sanctioned. He returned to Lagos that afternoon and called his chief of staff. Historical HR and internal reporting files. A specific period of years. No explanation given. She had them ready in 90 minutes. Chukwuemeka Dike's employment file was thick, not because it was a record of problems, but because it was a record of excellence. Performance evaluations bordering on superlatives. Commendations from supervisors and clients. Technical contributions that had saved the company money year after year. The file of a man who had given everything to an institution that had, in the end, given him nothing back. And there, toward the back, in a category labeled Internal Compliance Reports, reviewed, was the report. Stamped in red, "No action required." Signed by a man who had been his operations director at the time, a man now retired comfortably, enjoying his grandchildren in a large house in Ikoyi. Chief Nwosu read the report. Slowly. Completely. Without the pressure of a schedule or the instinct to delegate. He read every sentence. The technical analysis, precise, correct, proven correct by the crash that came 6 months after it was filed. The risk assessment, clear and accurate. The cost-benefit comparison, as plain as language could make it. He sat with the file in the silence of his empty office. A man had seen a problem. Documented it with extraordinary competence. His system had ignored it. People had died. The man who tried to prevent those deaths had been punished for trying. He had disappeared under circumstances nobody thought it necessary to properly investigate. And he had left behind a son who had come to the edge of his airstrip that morning looking for broken gadgets to fix and sell because he was hungry, who had heard the shouting and followed it through a gap in the fence, and had fixed the very fault his father had warned them about. That child was 12 years old. And they had stamped his father's report. Filed it. Moved on. Chief Obiora Emmanuel Nwosu sat with that truth for a long time. Then he picked up the phone. He sent his chief of staff and a senior operations manager to find Somto that evening. They went to the Oshodi workshop. Got a description of where the boy slept, a corner of the compound the mechanics had allowed him to use. He was not there. His few possessions were a thin sleeping mat, a cardboard box of books, almost entirely technical manuals, extensively annotated in a small, careful handwriting that was striking in its precision, and his father's tools, the small collection that had traveled with him since he was 11. Cleaned. Organized. Each one placed exactly so. Maintained with a tenderness that told you everything about the person who maintained them. Not tools. Relics. The physical remains of a man taken too early, kept alive in the hands of his child. Somto had done what he always did when something inside him broke open, walked. He had said the words he had never said to anyone, set them down on that tarmac, and turned away. The walking became something longer, something that was part grief and part a feeling he did not have a name for. On the third day they found him in a small chop house in Ajij. A 12-year-old boy eating rice and stew alone at a table, with the focused deliberateness of someone for whom a meal is not a pleasure but an act of survival. The operations manager sat down across from him without being invited. "Mr. Nwosu would like to see you." Somto looked at him, then out the window, then back. His expression was not surprise. It was the expression of someone who had known this was coming since the moment he said his name on that tarmac. "I know," he said. Chief Nwosu's office on the 43rd floor of Nwosu Tower was designed to communicate the distance between the person behind the desk and the person across from it. Somto sat in the chair across the desk. He was 12 years old and the chair was too large for him. His feet, in worn shoes, did not quite touch the floor. He sat in it the way he sat on workshop crates, upright, settled, entirely present. The size of the room did not touch him. He had slept on concrete floors in Lagos. He had learned that dignity is not something the size of a room can give or take. Chief Nwosu came in. He did not sit immediately. He stood behind his desk for a moment, and for the first time perhaps in many years, there was something in his posture that was not certainty. He looked at the child in the enormous chair across from him. Then he placed a document on the desk between them. "Your father wrote this," he said. Somto looked at it. He had never seen it before. His mother had told him it existed. In those 2 years of fighting, she had told him everything she knew. But he had never seen the document itself. He looked at his father's handwriting, the signature at the bottom, the careful, precise script of a meticulous man, and something moved behind his eyes that Chief Nwosu watched and did not look away from. "Yes," Somto said. "He was right," Chief Nwosu said. "About everything. The technical analysis. The risk assessment. He was completely right. And my company did not listen. And people died." A pause. The pause of a man not searching for the comfortable version of what he needs to say. "And then your father disappeared. I am investigating that. Fully. Whatever I find, you will know it before anyone else does." Somto said nothing. He was looking at his father's handwriting. At the signature that said, the way all signatures do, "I was here. I existed. I tried. I want to offer you," Chief Nwosu began. "I don't want anything," Somto said. His voice was quiet. His feet still did not quite touch the floor. He was 12 years old and he meant every word. "Whatever you decide to do, it should be because it is right. Not because it is an offer. Not because it is a transaction. Because it is right." Chief Nwosu looked at this child across his enormous desk, this 12-year-old who had fixed his helicopter that morning and was now telling him what power was actually for, and he felt something cold and real and profoundly uncomfortable arrive inside him. Something that did not ask to be praised. Humility. The real kind. What would be right, he asked. The families of the men who died over the Niger Delta, if their settlement was calculated to protect the company rather than honor the men, that changes. That is the first thing. Chief Nwosu nodded. Once. Without argument. The truth about my father. Whatever it is. And if what you find implicates people in this company by name, it goes to the appropriate authorities. Not managed internally. Referred. A slower nod. The kind that costs something. And the systems. Whatever allowed my father's report to be stamped and forgotten, whatever allowed someone to look at a document describing a fatal fault and write no action required, that cannot still be how this company works. "It doesn't," Chief Nwosu said. Then stopped. Because the automatic defensiveness in his voice had arrived before he chose it. And he recognized it for exactly what it was. "You were not sure of that when you said it," Somto said. "And that is worth paying attention to." Silence. "You are right," Chief Nwosu said. The investigation took 4 months. External auditors. A firm specializing in corporate compliance and historical incident review. Complete access. When 3 board members suggested, through lawyers, that this might not be in the company's best interests, Chief Nwosu overruled them with a finality that ended the conversation. What the investigators found was neither simple nor comfortable. They found that Chukwuemeka's report had been received, reviewed, and consciously set aside, not because the relevant people failed to understand it, but because they understood it perfectly. They had made a calculation. Knowing. Deliberate. The cost of the repair that quarter would affect numbers tied to an ongoing refinancing arrangement. And so they stamped the report. Filed it. Told themselves the probability was acceptable, the way men always tell themselves that when the alternative is inconvenient. They found that the crash over the Niger Delta had been investigated at the time by an aviation authority whose lead investigator had a relationship with the company's operations director that was, at minimum, a significant conflict of interest. The finding of pilot error had not been supported by evidence. It was the most convenient conclusion available, and it had been selected accordingly. They found that Chukwuemeka, in the months before his disappearance, had made contact with a journalist at a national newspaper. That this contact had been discovered inside the company. That the discovery had been communicated directly to the operations director. They could not find direct evidence of what happened next. The paper trail had been managed carefully by people who understood that the most dangerous documents are the ones that are too specific. But what the investigators found, in the gaps and the absences and the patterns of what was missing, assembled a picture that nobody wanted to say out loud. The outline was there. And the outline was enough. Chief Nwosu gave Somto the entire report and sat across from him in silence for the 2 hours it took the boy to read every page. He watched a 12-year-old child read the documented story of what had been done to his father, and he did not look away, because looking away was what had made all of this possible in the first place. When Somto set the report down, he was very still. His face had not broken. It was not a face that broke easily. But something in his eyes told the truth about what the reading had cost him. Grief. Confirmation. The exhaustion of someone who has spent years not being certain of something terrible, and is now, finally, certain. "I want to say something to you," Chief Nwosu said. "Not as a defense. Not as a negotiation. Because you are owed the truth, and I will give you nothing less." Somto waited. "I did not know," Chief Nwosu said. "I did not know what was done with your father's report. I did not know what happened afterward. I am not telling you this because it absolves me. It does not. I was responsible for the people who made those decisions. I should have built systems that made those decisions impossible. I am telling you because you are owed the truth, and the truth is that I did not know." Somto looked at him for a long time. A 12-year-old boy holding the gaze of a 61-year-old billionaire. Neither of them looked away. "I believe you did not know," he said. "I also believe that not knowing was a choice. You chose to delegate knowing to people who had reasons not to know. Not knowing was the reward for not looking. And that is also a decision." "Yes," Chief Nwosu said. "It is. My father knew everything happening in your machines and your systems. He tried to tell you. The cost of your company's not knowing was paid entirely by the people who could least afford it. By my father. By my mother. By those 2 men over the Niger Delta. By their families. By me. That is how it always works. The people at the top are insulated from the cost of their blindness by the people at the bottom who have no such insulation. And the people at the bottom pay." The office was quiet. "Not this time," Chief Nwosu said. The quietest thing he had ever said. And the most important. The families of the 2 engineers who died over the Niger Delta received settlements. Chief Nwosu called each family personally. Not through a lawyer. Himself. In the evening, when the formal business of the day was done. He spoke in plain language to people who had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for someone to finally say, "This was wrong. You are owed more than you received. I am sorry." The former operations director and his deputies were referred to the relevant authorities with the full investigative file and the company's complete cooperation. Chief Nwosu's lawyers were not deployed to protect them. This decision cost him relationships 20 years in the making. He let them go. The aviation journalist who had been contacted by Chukwuemeka years earlier, still working, still covering aviation safety, still asking the questions that somebody needed to ask, received the full investigative report and a statement from Chief Nwosu that had been laundered through nothing. The journalist published it. It was, in the judgment of those who covered such things, one of the most significant corporate accountability stories in Nigerian business history in a generation. Somto read it in his corner of the Oshodi workshop. Slowly, beginning to end. When he finished, he sat in the silence that follows the end of something that has been unfinished for a very long time. He thought about his father, his mother, a ceiling fan that wobbled on the left side, a thermos of black tea set down beside a toolbox, as though its owner intended to come back for it. He thought about a 4-year-old boy with 2 extra screws and a father's arms around him, fierce with love. You are going to be something. Something this world has never seen before. He sat with all of it. He was 12 years old, and he had lived more than most people live in 40 years. Then he got up. Because there was something still to do. And when I am certified, Somto continued, I want to work. Not as a favor. Not as a gift. Not as a gesture that helps you sleep at night. I want to work because I am good at what I do, and this company needs people who are genuinely, irreplaceably good at what they do. I want to be in the maintenance division. I want access to the safety and reporting systems. I want to build something, a team, a process, a culture, that makes it structurally impossible for a report like my father's to be stamped and forgotten. Impossible at the level of the organization's bones, not just its policies. He looked directly at Chief Nwosu across the small table. I am not asking for charity. What I have in here, he touched his chest, I earned on workshop floors and under work lamps and in the memories my father put in me before he was taken. I am asking for the structure around the knowledge. And I am telling you, not with arrogance, but with honesty, that when that structure is in place, I will do what needs to be done better than anyone else you have. That is simply true. Chief Nwosu looked at this 12-year-old child across the table. Educated by loss and by streets and by a father's hands and by technical manuals read under a single work lamp. Carrying in his small, calloused hands a knowledge that should, by every measure of justice, have been formally recognized long before now. And he felt something clean. Something that cut through the accumulated weight of decades of calculation and the comfortable numbness that power, when it goes unchallenged long enough, produces in the people who hold it. He felt hope. Not the optimistic, forward-looking hope of a man with plans. The deeper kind, the kind that arrives from the discovery that even the worst things, even the things that break what should never have been broken, can produce something that was not there before. Something that contains within it the full cost of everything it took to produce it, and is therefore more valuable than anything that comes easily. More true than anything that arrives without pain. Yes, Chief Nwosu said. And this time, the word held everything. 8 years later, Somto Dike, now 20 years old, certified, leading a team of 11 engineers and safety analysts at Nwosu Aviation Logistics, was presenting at a regional aviation safety conference in Accra. 36 minutes in, a woman in the third row raised her hand and asked him where he had first developed his understanding of aircraft systems. He paused. He looked at the room. Assembled professionals. Experts. People who had come from 7 countries to discuss the systems that keep aircraft in the air and the people inside them alive. They looked at him, this 20-year-old at the front of a professional conference, and they were already calculating the gap between his age and the authority with which he had been speaking. The professional answer was available. The brief, career-appropriate answer that would move the presentation forward and say nothing that was truly real. He did not give that answer. He told them about his father. A small apartment in Enugu with a ceiling fan that wobbled on the left side. Tools on a concrete floor and a child who watched, truly watched, while a man with extraordinary hands showed him what it meant to listen to something broken and take it seriously. He told them what happens when a man takes something seriously and the institution around him does not. He told them what that costs, not in the abstract, not as a case study, but specifically. Personally. He told them about being 11 years old and alone in Lagos. About an Oshodi workshop and a work lamp and aviation manuals read until the words became part of him. About a morning on a tarmac when he was 12 years old, hungry, carrying a cloth bag for broken gadgets, following the sound of a billionaire's shouting through a gap in a fence, and finding an engine that was speaking a language nobody else on that airstrip had been taught to hear. He told them all of it, in the quiet, measured, precise voice that those who knew him always said was his father's voice. The voice of someone who believes that truth is the most important thing in any room and will not dilute it for the comfort of anyone present. When he finished, the room was silent. Then someone began to clap. Then someone else. Then all of them. Somto stood at the front of that conference hall and received it, not with performed modesty, not with the satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for this moment, but with the same quality he had brought to everything since the age of 4, when he reassembled a radio with 2 screws left over and refused to look away from the imperfection. Present. Still. Unperformed. He thought about his father. The radio with the 2 extra screws. A helicopter engine coming to life on a Lagos morning while a hungry 12-year-old boy stood in the middle of a private airstrip, where he had no business being, and waited for laughter to finish. A CEO who had laughed, then gone silent, then, slowly, at great cost to himself, chosen to look at the thing he had spent years looking away from. He thought, I can fix this. And he had. And he would. And he would keep fixing it for as long as there were things broken enough to need him. Which, in this world, would be a very long time. Sometimes the people we overlook are the only ones who can see what the rest of us have refused to look at. Sometimes what begins as a broken machine is really just the beginning of a conversation that was always meant to happen. One that was delayed, not prevented. One that arrived, as the most important things always do, not when it was expected, not when it was convenient, not when it was easy, but exactly when it was needed. Chukwuemeka Dike was gone. But he had left something behind that could not be ignored, could not be filed, could not be stamped and set aside. He had left Somto. And Somto had left nothing broken that he could fix. Was the CEO truly redeemed, or just finally exposed? What would you have done in his position? Drop your answer in the comments. Every single one gets read. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark.